a video about stands that I use in the workshop. Most of the stands that I am going to show you in this are actually made by a company that doesn't exist as it did anymore. They're made by Anderson Stands, which was a company from Sydney, Chris Anderson. Chris sold the company 10 or more years ago now. Whoever bought it for a while didn't seem to make stands. Now they are making stands again, but they don't make all the stands they used to make. And in terms of the stands they used to make, the non-generic ones are the ones that I use mostly. So I'll run through all those stands. There are still some generic ones you can get, but some of these are going to be a bit unique. We'll start with Carbide Supersport because they're unique in the stands they use. This is a stand that we had at Moto Italiano when I started. I'm not sure who made them. You can see there's some bracing on here because at one point we realised this was bending and the bikes were getting closer to the ground. So we had to bend that back and then brace it. The problem with these is that they go around the header pipes. So you don't have a lot of space to play with. This rod goes through the bottom of the engine case, just there. And that hole is on all the Ducati engines, but the Carbide Supersports are about the only ones that actually have it accessible. You can use it on 851s and 888s, maybe. You can't use it on the Monsters because the Monsters have an insert with a thread in that hole on the right-hand side, and there's a little bracket that holds the fuel tank, drain and vent hoses. So you can't use it in them. You can't use it in injected Supersports because the rear brake master cylinder mount obscures the hole. In the 400 and 600 SS, like these, the 2-into-1 exhaust often comes down and sort of protrudes into the space that this goes through, so you can't use it on them even. So it's a bit unique, but it's a very good stand for what it does. You can also use these on the Sport Classics, or some of the Sport Classics. The GT1000s, you may end up with the rear brake master sitting on the stand itself. And so instead of being supported by the engine, it's being supported on that. I'm not sure how strong that is, so you need to be wary of that. If you try and use it on a Sport Classic or a GT, just be aware of anything that's taking the load that you don't want to be taking the load. If you've got a bike in bits, or you're building a bike up from whatever, and you can access this hole, then it's a good way to do it because it means the engine itself is supported. The engine stands that we used to use at Moto Italiano that we had, most of them used this hole to support the engine because it was accessible on most of the models. If you're pulling an engine out, it was a good way to support a bike. Now I have a different engine stand. So these stands, this is just, as I said, I don't know where this one came from. We had two of them. I've cut one up since, I think. But they're a good stand and they just go through. Just work around the fairing and the exhaust headers up to there. Feed it through, comes out to the side, goes into the other side, and then now it is in effect, it's a centre stand. And then you can pull the back of the bike down. We used to put a tie down around the back wheel, pull the back of the bike down so the front end's up in the air. You can do anything you want to the bikes on this stand. It's really good. You can pull the rear shock out to do the vertical valve clearance on the exhaust. This is an Anderson version of it. I never liked this one at Moto 1. It was mainly because the rod is quite a bit smaller than the holes. These two bits of tube here are ones that I've added to make the stand much closer to the engine dimension and support the rod a lot better. And it makes a big difference. It's now much more stable than it was without these two bits here when you had this gap from here to here being supported by not overly strong rod. Like that, it's much better. But Anderson don't make this anymore, as far as I'm aware. The other stand I would use on these is just your generic L bracket swing arm stand. Again, this is an Anderson stand, but lots of people make these stands. I bought one recently that's an Oxford version of it, but really generic. If you need to make them wider or narrower for your swing arm, you can adjust them, or you just bend the stand itself. They're pretty flexible. A lot of people don't like these because they aren't really secure, but I've never had an issue, I must say, using these. I would use this on Carbide Supersport, Injected Supersport, Monsters with dual-sided swing arms. Pretty much anything with a flat dual-sided swing arm works well on one of these. Just stand the bike up. This one's basically always preset for SS or Monster. And there you go. Some people don't like them because they're not stable enough, but I find them particularly stable. I do anything that I'd want to do on this stand. If I'm going to lift the front up, jack it up or anything, I would put a tie down around the back wheel, around the bench, and just tie the bike down to the bench on the stand, and like that they are super stable. These stands have lots of generic feet for them. That's your typical L-shaped foot. You could also get these sort of feet. They'll hook onto a swing arm spool. We had these for 851s and 888s, and the early 900 Monsters that had the 851 888 swing arm. You could also use these. These are a much narrower foot stand, and these are for the first of the 999s and 749s with the narrow swing arm. These were never that great. I really didn't like using these on 749s and 999s. So what we eventually started using on them, and similar to what I use on any of the Monsters with the ST based frame, you can use it on an ST without a centre stand, and that is you simply get one of these stands, pull these out and put a rod through it. So what you have is this stand like so, a rod like that. On any of the bikes with the larger axles with the hole in them that goes all the way through, you can't use it on one of these Carbide Supersports or an early Monster because the hole in the axle is just too small. But anything with a 25mm rear axle, these work well. You can also put it through the front axle on bikes with 25mm front axles. I don't do that very often, but if you want to lift the bike both ends squarely, so you want to do a suspension setup and have both ends off the ground the same amount, you can certainly do it for that. It's quite stable like that. If you have one of these in the bike, it simply can't fall over. You can't pull the rear wheel out, but everything else you can do, and it works really well. This pin, which is a piece of steel tube, is about, it's 15.8, so that would make it 5/8, I think. So 15.8, 5/8, 15mm, that goes through pretty much any of the 25mm axle swing arm pivots. Sometimes you find if they've been a bit corroded or dirty inside, they're hard to get through. You might need a smaller rod, but I use that rod for pretty much everything. If that one won't go through, then this rod, which is 12mm, certainly does. But a 15mm rod you should be safe with. For the 999s and 749s, I use this rod, which is 20mm. We actually had some of them plated. We had a whole lot cut and plated, and we sold them to 999 owners as a good secure stand. And again, most of these stands, that 20mm rod will fit through. And what I do is I use these two pieces of plastic sleeve to go either side of the swing arm to keep the stand off the swing arm. That's mainly for the 2005 and later bikes with those big black swing arms, because the paint on those swing arms just falls off. Just have a look at it, it falls off. So anything you can do to protect it from a stand is a good idea. I tend not to use the spool mounts that those stands usually have. They have the boss with the thread at least usually. I don't use them just because these are so much more stable. When the 916 first appeared with a single-sided swing arm, this is an early Anderson stand for them. It has a bearinged axle support. I'm pretty sure there was a version of this that was all solid, no bearings, that came in the crate with maybe the SPs, the 916 SPs. There was certainly a factory stand you could get, and it was painted the goldy bronze colour, same as the frame was. I don't recall what models they came with. Certainly with XPs, I think they were delivered. Stand pin. The small section is 21.7mm, and the large section is 25.75. And that piece is 36.2mm, and that piece about the same. These are okay, but they're not very easy to use. They're just a bit cumbersome. There's a fair bit of effort required to get it to roll. Then these ones become available. Same thing, but with wheels. Very easy to use. Put the pin in the axle. Stand it up. Super stable. Sit there all day. Now, there's a few different versions of that. There was a right-hand side one. And the pin on that, what is that? 28.9. And 28.9, 140mm. This goes from the right-hand side, so you can take the sprocket carrier off, do sprocket changes, that sort of thing. For some reason, I don't find this as secure as that, even though it's longer. It's just a mental thing, I'm sure, but I've never liked having bikes on this stand for long periods of time, whereas I'll let it sit for years on that stand. The same stand comes in various size pins. This is the MV pin, which is much larger. This also fitted the first of the 1098s. It is 42.4, 42.3 maybe. And we use these on all the MVs and the first of the 1098s. But then, sometime into 1098 production, they changed the size of the hole in the axle. They made it smaller. I guess they made the axle a thicker wall section. And so this is a 1098, 1198, multi-strata, monster, whatever stand, and it is 40.2mm. If you put this stand into an MV or an early 1098, the bike will rock around. You can move it quite a bit, whereas into an 1198, they are really nice and stable. You can also get these stands with wheels that go 3 directions, and they are quite handy. If you're using it for a garage, you put the stand in and swing the back of the bike around against a wall, that sort of thing. So there's lots of variations of the single-sided swing arm stands, and as long as it's a good brand, they're all much for muchness. This next stand is what Chris used to call a swing arm pivot stand. This one, which is a low one, is actually made to suit Moto Guzzi spine frame models, which is Daytonas, Sport 11s, V1100s, those things. And these cups here go onto the bottom nut of the side plate mount, so it goes through underneath the engine, underneath the gearbox, and you goes that way on the bike. Spread it out, put it over the nut, pull it up, clamp it up, and then it becomes in effect a centre stand. It's a great little stand. It only has a supporting foot on one side because at that point in time it didn't seem like it really needed one on each side, and that was a great stand. I actually had a couple of customers order these, who still own the business, for their Daytonas or sports. It's just a great stand. It makes working on those bikes really easy. By far the best thing you can do for them. That's the low version. This is the taller version, and this one has a supporting foot on both sides, which was something I had Chris do. This is a fantastic stand. It's much taller. It has about 7 positions, so I think that's the lowest, and that's the highest there. And I actually had Chris make some longer arms for me at one point, because with them at the highest position, with multi 1000s, 1100s, 1200s and the hyper motards, they could be a little bit low. So he made these up for me, which the highest setting is quite a bit taller. I think they probably end up, about there somewhere when I use them. And these ends, I have various bits of aluminium machined to go in there, poke out the side. You can put a tube through, do whatever you want. The way this one's meant to work is it goes through the swing arm pivot, like here. And it does work very well on the Ducati, says that. You run it down very low, put this pin through the swing arm pivot, like so. I have the plastic bushes either side just to stop it from hitting anything. And like that, it's a very stable stand. But it also works particularly well using these bosses, and you'll have various size bosses poking out. These are adjustable, where you can pull them right out. Put something else in there, you can put end pieces in there. End pieces of various sizes to make it suit different things. But what I do with this is these go very well in the frame bolt recesses on the engine mounts. So we'll just stand it up. Again, just using the L-shaped generic stand on this probably 2000 monster steel swing arm. Lift the front up. You just set these adjustable pins so you can't move the stand at all sideways. Then lift the bracket, pick it up. Now the front's off the ground, and that is super stable. Some of them I even pull the rear stand out, maybe a 916. You might not have enough height to get the front wheel off the ground, because the rear stands often lift those rear wheels quite a long way off the ground. You can pull the rear stand out, and it's not going to go anywhere. It's fantastic. So if I'm doing any front end work at all, I use this stand, because you can just pull anything out that you want. I don't use any understeering head stands at all, or any of the lower fork stands. I'm sure I have got some fittings to use them as fork bottom stands, and again it's just these generic style stands with different feet, but I just don't like them. I saw someone gouge some fork legs really early on using one of these stands with feet for bottoms of fork legs, so I just don't like them. But this is just superb. You can also use it for the rear. I'll just lower it a bit. Go to the fifth hole. Like this, you'll need to sometimes space it out to clear footrests, gear levers, that sort of thing. Depends on the bike you're working on. This one's all stripped down, so it makes it easy. But in there, again, it's stable. It's never going to fall over. And I use this stand if I'm pulling the shock out or a swing arm out, rear wheel out. If I'm doing, say, a 916, I need to pull the shock out, I'll use this stand. You can also go through the swing arm pivot, but if you have it supported here, you can also check the swing arm play, re-shin the swing arm, knock the pin out, all that sort of thing. So this is just a fantastic stand. I use it all the time, but they don't make it anymore. Would be fairly easy to copy though in concept. Got to make sure when you're putting it back onto that one, it goes back on. If I want to hold a bike vertical without really doing anything in terms of changing its altitude, which if I'm doing a suspension setup with the owner sitting on the bike, I like to do that. I'll use one of these stands, these front wheel stands. I have seen bikes left in these. We had a bike at Moto 1 upstairs in the spare parts area sitting on one of these stands for months, just to show people that you could use this stand just to hold a bike in it. There's no rear stand or anything on it, it's just in there, sitting there. I think eventually it did slowly start to tilt a little bit, but generally they are very good at what they do. And if I'm doing a suspension setup, I'll usually put this in the front wheel so the bike can sit there. You can have the owner sit on the bike, put their feet up on the foot pedestal, that sort of thing. And the bike hasn't really changed its altitude. It's still really close to being on the ground. That's what you want when you're doing suspension setup. You don't want the front raised or the back raised. For another Moto Guzzi application, I use this in conjunction with this on Breva, Sport, Grisso, 1100s, 1200s. It goes through the hole in the frame. Some of them have two little screws that go down. Maybe that's the Brevas. And you take those two little screws out, they just hold a trim panel, I think. You take them out and then this goes inside. I put this piece inside the frame and it goes up and sits on the inside of the frame tube and spaces the bar off the frame tube enough that this supports the bike, not the two end pieces. Got these pads to protect the frame and then it goes in there. I take these out, slide in like so. And that's again a really good stable stand for a Grisso, Breva, Sport. You need to hold the bike vertical somehow to fit this usually. So you need to often tie the bikes down, tie down around the front forks to hold it vertical. And then you can just put this together and put it in, put it under, then the bike's held. That will have the back wheel off the ground a bit, then you can jack the front wheel up if you need the front wheel off the ground, that sort of thing. But it just makes a nice stable stand for those bikes. And they are fairly hard to support otherwise. There's one other stand I use, which is again an Anderson stand, which I possibly don't make anymore. If I'm supporting a bike that has the front end out of it and it's just sitting for some time, I don't want it cluttering a bench up, I'll put it off against the wall and use this stand. And I'll show you how it works. Like a lot of these things, it's a multi-phase project or multi-step process. And especially when you're doing all this on your own, the main consideration is for not dropping bikes on the ground. So it might take a little bit longer, but you're just doing everything you need to make sure they don't go down. I think it's about the right height. So I have my bar. I usually put some plastic on it just to protect the frame paint. Not overly important on this bike because it's pretty rough and it's going to get painted. I've got a problem here that my tubes are not going to be far enough forward to clear the stand in there. Let's see if I can make it work. I maybe should have moved this stand in narrower before I tried to start. Anyway. That's sitting up there. When I take this stand out, the whole thing's going to roll forward. Sometimes that happens, but it should be stable once it's there. You might need to poke your tongue out. And there we go. Now that's supported, it's nice and stable, wobbles a bit side to side, but it's not going anywhere. The only issue with this is that when I have them on the benches, I walk into these all the time. It's usually on this bench in the middle, and then I bang myself on these. But that's a good stand if it's just going to be dead, and I don't want to use up this stand. I really can't put this stand under any bikes for any period of time, because I use it so often. It's just such a good stand. If you don't have stands like this, there are other ways to support bikes. There's a beam on the roof up here that goes across. It's not very strong. If I support a bike on it, often I'll lift the bench all the way up, put a tie down from here somewhere to that beam, let it down, the beam bends as it comes down. It's just a little bracing beam for the roof. But that's one way. If you have a garage or a shed with open roof bracing, you can hang bikes from the roof braces. That's a really good way to do it. Or you can use jack stands with rods through the swing arm pivot if you like, put the whole thing up on stands there, or through the hole in the bottom of the engine cases if it goes through. So there's various ways you can support bikes, but these stands are about the best that I've sort of used. Unfortunately, you can't get a lot of them anymore, but if you want to make some, you can certainly do that. These stands, for instance, one issue with these ones was that this cross brace hit the header pipe on the 900s. I'm not sure why it was made that way. Possibly before these bent after prolonged use, it wasn't so bad, but when they had bent a bit, it just didn't have the height anymore. But these holes are about 300 mil off the ground, and probably about, the hole point is probably about 100 mil back from the forward support. So it'd be fairly easy to make a stand like this. Across there, 215 mil. These ones are pretty close to the width of the engine cases. They're always a really good stand like that. And the pin itself is 10 millimeters. So this sort of stand is a good idea. It's a really good centre stand substitute if you like for bikes that never had centre stands. And you could make it taller if you wanted to, if you wanted to go through the swing arm pivot. On this stand, the side frame rails are 295 millimeters apart. On the Anderson, they're quite a bit wider. They are 355 or so. With the Anderson stands, you can find that the gear lever and the brake pedal will hit this. If you're trying to bleed brakes or change gears, this stand might obstruct you doing that. But otherwise, it's a good stand to have in the workshop. I think this one's probably so wide so that it moves it outside the exhaust headers. Whereas this one, this clearance in here is very much dependent on clearing the exhaust headers. And I would imagine that if you put a brace across there, it won't work because that's where the exhaust pipe is. This really needs to have a big bend, which is why these ones actually started collapsing.